You don't belong on this podium." They thought she was lost until they read the document. 10 minutes ago, they tried to remove her. Now she controls the entire orchestra. The words echoed across the empty concert hall. "This podium isn't for people like you." The rehearsal manager's voice sliced through the quiet like a wrong note in a symphony. Dr. Naomi Carter stood on the conductor's podium, baton resting lightly in her hand. In front of her, dozens of orchestra musicians had already begun packing up their instruments. No one in that room realized that the next 10 minutes would completely change the power structure of the entire institution. The Grandbridge Concert Hall had hosted some of the greatest musicians in history. Portraits of legendary conductors stared down from the balcony walls, as if silently observing what was about to unfold. Naomi adjusted the music score in front of her. It was exactly 2 p.m. She wore a simple black rehearsal jacket and carried a worn leather satchel beside the podium. The only accessory on her wrist was an old watch that had once belonged to the mentor who taught her how to conduct her first orchestra. Footsteps approached from the side of the stage. "Excuse me." The rehearsal manager, Edward Langford, walked toward her with the confident stride of someone used to being in charge. "Who authorized you to be on that podium?" Naomi turned calmly. "I have a rehearsal scheduled for 2 o'clock, she replied. "Beethoven's 7th. A few musicians paused mid-conversation. Langford let out a short laugh. "I believe there's been some confusion," he said, loudly enough for the orchestra to hear. "This is a private rehearsal for Maestro Jonathan Hale." "I'm not here for an audition," Naomi answered quietly. What Langford didn't know was that the woman standing in front of him had conducted orchestras in Vienna, London, and Tokyo. Naomi slowly opened her satchel and removed a folder. "My credentials are here if you'd like to review them." Langford barely glanced at the papers. "Ma'am," he said impatiently, "I'm sure whatever program you're involved with is impressive, but this hall operates at a different level." Across the stage, the concertmaster lowered her violin slightly, sensing tension. Naomi held out the folder again. "Perhaps you should look before making assumptions." Langford took the documents with a sigh, clearly intending to end the conversation quickly. He opened the first page. His eyes scanned the letterhead. Then he stopped. He looked again. Color drained from his face. This can't be right." The concertmaster stood up from her chair. "What is it, Edward?" But Langford couldn't answer. His hands trembled as he turned the page. Naomi glanced down at her watch calmly. "Would you like me to summarize?" she asked. Langford swallowed. You can't be. The board would have told me." "They did," Naomi replied. She pulled out her phone and opened an email. The subject line was clear. "New music director appointment. Confidential." "You received it 18 days ago." Silence filled the hall. The musicians stopped pretending not to watch. Langford stammered. "We get hundreds of emails." The subject line said urgent. At that moment, the back door of the hall opened. Footsteps echoed down the aisle. Eleanor Whitaker, chair of the board of directors, entered the room. "Edward," she called, "I received your message about an unauthorized person on stage." Langford looked like a man watching his career collapse. "There's been a misunderstanding." Dr. Carter spoke before he could finish. "I introduced myself and explained I had a scheduled rehearsal. Mr. Langford chose to assume I didn't belong here." Eleanor Whitaker stopped near the front row. "Dr. Carter," she said, "on behalf of the Grandbridge board, I apologize for this reception. It does not reflect the enthusiasm we have for your arrival." Around the hall, musicians quietly pulled out their phones. One whispered, "Naomi Carter. She conducted the Vienna Festival last year." Another added, "She has 3 Grammy-nominated recordings." Langford still held the folder. But how was I supposed to know? Whitaker's expression hardened. You had the board memo. You had her name, and you had a chance to ask a question before judging. Naomi stepped down from the podium and approached him. You may want to read the final page, she said softly. Langford turned to the last sheet. His eyes widened. Dr. Naomi Carter has committed an $8 million endowment to establish the Future Harmony Initiative, a national program designed to expand access and diversity in classical music. As principal donor, Dr. Carter will serve on the executive committee with full advisory authority. The papers slipped from his hands. $8 million. The woman he had just dismissed had become one of the most influential figures in the building's history. The concertmaster slowly stood. Dr. Carter, I didn't realize you were our new music director. The announcement was scheduled for next week, Naomi replied. I wanted to meet the orchestra without introductions first. The board chair understood immediately. It was a test, Naomi nodded, and I learned something important. She gathered the scattered pages and walked back to the podium. Despite decades of diversity statements, she said quietly, a black woman on this stage is still more likely to be mistaken for lost than for the conductor. The musicians looked down. One by one, they stood. But Naomi raised her baton before anyone could speak. Let's begin rehearsal. Music stands shifted into position, instruments lifted. Beethoven's Seventh, she said, from the beginning. Her baton paused in the air for one perfect moment of silence. Then it dropped, and the orchestra discovered that the woman they had doubted was one of the finest conductors they had ever worked with. The first movement ended with a sharp motion of Naomi's baton. Silence filled the hall. Not the awkward silence from earlier, but the kind musicians respected, the kind that followed something powerful. Dr. Naomi Carter slowly lowered her hands. Across the orchestra, players looked at each other in disbelief. The transformation in their sound during the rehearsal had been undeniable. The strings were tighter, the brass more controlled, the entire orchestra breathing together like a single organism. Finally, the concertmaster spoke. That was incredible. Several musicians nodded quietly. Naomi stepped down from the podium again, placing the baton gently on the music stand. I appreciate the compliment, she said calmly. But today wasn't about proving that I can conduct. Her eyes moved across the orchestra. It was about understanding something. No one spoke. Even Edward Langford remained frozen near the edge of the stage. Naomi continued. When I walked into this hall today, I didn't introduce myself as the new music director. I didn't mention the board, the contracts, or the endowment. She paused. I simply walked in as a conductor, ready for rehearsal. The musicians shifted uncomfortably, and yet within minutes, she continued, several assumptions were made about who I was and why I was here. The principal cellist looked down at his instrument. Naomi's tone wasn't angry. It was measured, controlled, like a conductor shaping a difficult passage. I've spent 25 years in classical music, she said, from conservatories to international stages, and I can tell you something that many people in this industry don't like to admit. She looked toward the balcony seats. Talent is universal. Her gaze returned to the orchestra. But opportunity rarely is. The words hung in the air. Margaret Whitaker, still standing near the front row, folded her arms thoughtfully. Naomi picked up the baton again, turning it slowly between her fingers. When I created the Future Harmony Initiative, she continued, it wasn't just about scholarships or outreach programs. Several musicians leaned forward. It's about changing the pipeline. She gestured toward the orchestra. Many of you probably began playing your instruments before you were 10 years old. Private teachers, youth orchestras, summer programs. A few musicians nodded. Now imagine a talented child who never gets access to any of that. She paused. No instruments, no teachers, no audition opportunities. The hall was completely silent. That child might have just as much musical ability as anyone here, Naomi said quietly. But the door never opens. Edward Langford finally spoke, his voice subdued. Dr. Carter, I owe you an apology. All eyes turned toward him. He stepped forward slowly. I made an assumption today that I shouldn't have. Naomi studied him for a moment. Yes, she said simply. You did. The honesty of the response surprised several people, but Naomi wasn't finished. The question isn't whether someone makes a mistake, she continued. The question is what they do after realizing it. Langford nodded slowly. I'd like to help with the initiative if I can. Naomi considered that for a moment. Good, she said, because this program will require cooperation from everyone in this building. Margaret Whitaker stepped forward. The board meeting tonight will focus on exactly that, she said. Implementation begins immediately. Several orchestra members exchanged curious glances. Naomi turned back toward the musicians. The Future Harmony Initiative will fund youth orchestras in underserved communities across the country, she explained. Instrument libraries, free instruction, national audition opportunities. The second violinist raised a hand slightly. Will members of this orchestra be involved? Naomi smiled faintly. Very much so. A murmur moved through the room. Every musician here will have the opportunity to mentor young players, she continued. Workshops, community concerts, master classes. She looked around the hall. This orchestra has extraordinary talent, and with that talent comes responsibility. The concertmaster nodded. That sounds like something worth building. Naomi stepped back onto the podium. Good, she said, because we're going to start building it together. She lifted the baton again. But first, she added with a small smile, we still have Brahms to finish. Soft laughter moved through the orchestra, easing the tension that had filled the room earlier. Music stands shifted again. Instruments lifted. Naomi looked across the musicians, meeting their eyes one by one. The earlier skepticism had been replaced by something else. Respect, perhaps even admiration. She raised the baton. Second movement, she said. The hall fell silent once more. This time, the silence felt different. Not like uncertainty, but like the quiet moment before a powerful new beginning. And when the music began again, it carried with it the promise that something in that historic concert hall had truly changed.